Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. We are in week 65 together. We're going to be mostly in Judges. We're in Judges 5 through 8, and we also have the reading of Psalm 64 this week. We finished up the Gospel of Luke, and we won't get back to the Gospel of John until a few more weeks. We're going to be here in Judges. But first, our scenery is a little different today because it is Passion Week. And there's a lot of stuff going on in our church. We had Good Friday, and then we have a whole bunch of Easter things today for the kids. And then we have Sunday morning service for Easter. We're in a different location. We're actually in Craig's home today.
Welcome.
So thank you for having us here.
Get to see my books. I think I was probably dialed in from here in one of our Zoom-based podcasts last year. But now we're both here and doing the podcast from here this week. That's about one of the only spaces we could think of to do it from.
Yeah, Rich, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So since we're in his home, I thought I'm going to let Craig be our host today.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I am happy to play a host. You always do a good job. Give you a little bit of a break this week, but I'm not sure we gave you much of a break because in our study, you really dove deep this week, and I feel like you had some of the Holy Spirit anointing upon you this week with some of the stuff you carried away. So I feel a little bit lucky to get to play host this week because then I can just ask you all the hard questions and you have the answers.
Maybe. I hope to bring some light to sometimes some confusing passages.
Yeah. So setting the context for chapter 5 a little bit, going back into chapter 4, God had called Barak to go fight against the people who were oppressing Israel at this time, which were from Canaan, Jabin the king and his general Sisera, and they were from the region of Hazor, going back to chapter 4, the first couple of verses again. But as Barak goes to Deborah, who was anointed as a prophetess, to try to get guidance, he doesn't really follow through on what God has commanded him, does he?
He doesn't. He says, yeah, that sounds like a good plan, Deborah, but only if you come with me.
Yes.
Only if you come with me. And she's like, all right, well, if I come with you, then you're not going to get the glory, but a woman will. And everyone assumes it's going to be Deborah, but we find out later it wasn't Deborah at all.
Yeah, it's Sisera who crushes, it's Jael, the woman called Jael who crushes the head of Sisera.
That's right.
Yeah, and so then we get this song in chapter 5 that is a poetic retelling of that story that we had in chapter 4.
Yeah, what is interesting, the first thing that stood out to me was, I was like, is this a recounting of the Exodus story? Because then
a lot of that language.
Because in Exodus 14, you have the Red Sea, and then in narrative, and then after that, immediately after, the very next chapter was the Song of Moses.
Oh, yes.
And so when I saw the Song of Deborah, I thought, I wonder if this is a callback. So I went back and looked for some key languages. And sure enough, in chapter 4, which I missed last week, but I caught this week, in chapter 4, there are some terminology and some language that is used in the chapter 4 story with Deborah and Barak and Sisera that calls back directly to the Exodus story. You have these chariots of iron, 900 chariots of iron, or the same thing Pharaoh's army had was chariots of iron. And then also you have this thing where the Lord routed Sisera. This is the same exact word that was used in Exodus where God said that when Pharaoh's army was in the water and it says that they confused them. Exactly the same word. How were they rerouted? We'll find out in chapter 5 how they were rerouted. And then you have a body of water mentioned, and we find out next chapter that body of water is how they were rerouted. It was the flood. They got flooded.
The river of Kishon in verse 21 of chapter 5.
Chapter 5, it says specifically that water was kind of flooded, and it's what overtook them.
Swept them away.
Swept them away. That is exactly the same language from the Exodus story.
Yeah.
And then immediately then you have the Song of Deborah. So this is basically another Exodus.
Yeah. And what do you think we're supposed to take away from that? What's the lesson? Are we setting up Deborah as a new Moses?
I don't think so, no. I think this is us, God saying that people need to be delivered, right? They've been delivered once, they've fallen away from me, right? We need another deliverance and get them back to following me again. And so this is just an Exodus story in the Promised Land, trying to get people back on track to follow God.
So it's almost like they're suppressed in their own land, now they need an Exodus from their own land.
Exactly.
Back into their own land.
Back into their own land, but with God.
Yeah.
As back.
They're in the land, and apart from God, you need to be back with God.
Right, and Judges is just another word for deliverer, and that's what the Judges are supposed to do. So this whole book is like a list of people who God is trying to use as deliver them over and over again.
Angel, but there's also angels throughout here because In chapter 20, there's the heaven, from heaven the stars fought.
Yes.
And so all this language of heavenly bodies coming together, what do you make of that?
Yeah. If you did not know that, that's a phrase that's used quite often through the Old Testament. And we're going to see it's used some in the New Testament as well. A language of stars fighting, or host of stars. Those are angels. In a poetic way of saying them, right? So what you have here is you have angels joining in the fight. And I think this is really fascinating because God has chosen to use a partnership between the sons of God, which are the angels, and the adopted children of God, which is Israel. And he's had this partnership where they're fighting together, even if the humans don't even realize it, which is pretty beautiful. In the very next line, you have the where the Kishon River is being swept away and flooded. So here you have another thing. You have creation joining the fight as well.
So all three of God's, in a way, children.
Yeah, his created things.
His created beings come together to fight off evil.
Exactly. All three. God uses all three things that he created. It's the spiritual beings, the humans, and his creation coming together to push forward his purpose.
That's amazing. And that continues to remind me that the creation, whether it's rocks that would cry out if we were silent, whether it's the trees that you've been considering throughout, whether it's the stars and hosts of heaven here, well, that's the angels, but more point the river here, acting in the way that God guides. But whether it's the Red Sea, whether it's the Jordan River and the crossing, whether it's here the Kishon overflowing, there's rivers that play their part. So my point is the creation continues to play its part, even though it's groaning under the burden of man's sin. Yes. And it's waiting and longing to be redeemed. So there's that aspect of its playing its part also. It's a character all throughout the story.
It is a character. Even the ground even cries out to God. Yes. It has a voice of its own, it seems.
Right. And we saw that with Cain murdering Abel, and the blood in the ground cried out. And we've seen that come out. And
through the Joshua story, you hear that as well. Mm-hmm.
And then we see, I've mentioned this before, we see at the end of 2 Chronicles where the land will want its Sabbath rest.
That's right.
Yeah. So this takes us to the end of chapter 5, and in verses 24 through the end, we have these two women that are set up. We have Jael, who almost seems to be fighting on the side of God and crushing Sisera's head. Yeah. But then we have this mysterious mother of Sisera looking out the window. Yeah. This very early Judges callback to when Rahab was looking out the window and looking upon God's world. Yeah. Right? We call that out. But what do you think is going on between the comparison here?
Yeah, this one was a little tough at first when you read them. You're like, what's happening here at this end of the story? Why are all these random things kind of being repeated? You see some repeated language in these last two sections here. What's interesting is Jael, if you really think about it, I think is actually a mother figure. Think about it. She invites him in to her home. He asks for water and she gets him milk. In the story, she actually covers him up with a blanket. Yep. She keeps watch over him as he is sleeping, right? She's attending to his needs. It's almost like you're supposed to imagine having this mother figure, right? And then here you have the mother of Sisera in the story. So I think you're supposed to immediately say, okay, I'm supposed to compare these two. Why is this here? And with Jael, it's interesting. Like you said, she strikes him in the head in his temple, but it makes a point to talk about how he's between her feet. Why is that here? Some of this language might be hard to listen to, so if you get triggered easily, just know that there's maybe a little trigger warning happening here in just a moment. But this language is intentional, where it's basically supposed to imagine him between her, like he has fallen between her legs. Here at the end of his life, right? Now let's jump to the mother. The mother of Sisera is looking out the window, wondering where her son is. And you're supposed to, for a split second, I think you're supposed to feel some sort of like sad for her.
Like sympathy.
Like this mom, she's looking at her window waiting for Sisera to come home, but we know that he's not, because we just learned what happened to his life, right? Yeah. He's not coming home. And so you're supposed to feel bad for a split second. But that is stripped away as soon as you read to the next section, because what we find out is what's really on her mind. What's on her mind out the window is not when is their son coming home, but all the things that she's wondering and imagining her son doing. And what she's imagining him doing is basically killing people, taking over the land. It mentioned these women, these wombs. This word that is used is actually the most like disgusting word you can think of for women genitalia. In Hebrew, that's this word.
Wow.
And it's supposed to be really vile is the word. Basically, she's thinking that he's raping women and enjoying his pleasure. That's what she's imagining. She's imagining him having his pleasures being met. He's getting all the spoils from all the people he's killing. That's what's on her mind. So I felt empathy for a split second, and it was stripped immediately when you find out how evil and wicked this mom really is.
She has the most vile dehumanization possible on her mind.
That's
her intention in her heart.
Right. So, and it also mentions that she's interested in this fabric 3 times. The fabric, as long as he brings back this fabric, this material. Why is this mentioned 3 times? I think it's supposed to imagine she cares less about how many people is dying, and she doesn't care about the women who are being taken advantage of. All she cares about is that she will get this fabric.
Wow.
That is all that's on her mind. And while the mother is imagining her son taking women for pleasure, we know that he's between a woman's legs dying. And that's the image you're supposed to imagine here. This mom, as wicked as it sounds, and it's built this way for a reason. This is the mother of a Canaanite. Imagine how bad the rest of them are. I think that's what we're supposed to imagine. If she is that vile and disgusting and wicked and evil in her mind, just imagine what everyone else is going to be like. This is why they deserve to be destroyed. That's what Deborah's setting up here.
That's a great point. And since Deuteronomy, we've been talking about how wicked the Canaanites were and God's time of judgment was coming upon them for their sin. Mm-hmm. We saw that all throughout Judges. And here we see more evidence. These are the people that had child sacrifice. Yeah. They sacrificed their girls and didn't honor the role they had in the propagation of life. Yeah. And they're almost a death cult. And they're very anti-God, but you see a glimpse into their soul here.
You do.
I think you're absolutely right.
It's interesting how Deborah is writing this song and glorifying God clearly, mentioning Jael way more than she did Barak in this story. Yeah. So she gets the ultimate more glory than Barak himself did.
Going back to the prophecy of if Deborah told Barak, if I go with you, you're not, a woman's going to get the glory.
Yeah, and this is where it is, right here in this song. And then ultimately Deborah is saying, but listen, this is how evil they deserve to be destroyed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow. All right, so I think that's a wrap on Judges 5 and Deborah's story. So then in chapter 6, we pivot to Gideon. Yeah. We have a few years of rest, 40 years. It says the land had rest at the end of chapter 5. And then we get into chapter 6, and we have Midian just kind of swarming in like locusts. It says in verse 5. And so we get this scene of this horde. Yeah. And I always think of if you're a Star Trek fan, all these Borg cubes, just these are the people. You probably heard the phrase from Star Trek, resistance is futile. These are the Borg people who are just unstoppable, coming in and we will conquer you no matter what it takes. And just these hundreds of thousands of ships, but these are just probably millions of people coming in, Midianites, and not only conquering Israel, but they can't grow crops. The land is just taken over like locusts, like a swarm of locusts. Almost a callback to in my mind to the Exodus plague and on Egypt. And then the Israelites have to run to the hills. They can't even stay in their homes. They're just dispossessed. Yeah,
it's amazing. It's as if for 7 years straight, every time that crops were good, it was that time of year for that things are good.
Which is supposed to be almost a Sabbath rest.
Right, it's supposed to be Sabbath. Instead, these people would come in and just take everything they had. They weren't necessarily killing the Israelites per se, but they were taking everything they had where they could not survive without it. They were desperate people.
Yep. And so then in verse 7 of this chapter, the Israelites cry out for a deliverer. Mm-hmm. And what does God do? He doesn't send them a deliverer at this point, right? There's a prophet that enters, and what does the prophet do?
It's interesting because you're right. It's like so far they cry out and immediately says God hears their cries and he raises up a deliverer. Yep. Right? And then here he hears their cries, and this time he doesn't raise up a deliverer. He sends a prophet to send judgment. Yeah. Yeah.
Judges has judgment.
Judges have judgment. They do. So that's interesting. And then we get introduced to Gideon.
Yes.
Shortly after.
And so I read out of the ESV. It says the call of Gideon in my subtitle.
Yeah.
But you made this point that God actually doesn't. The text doesn't say that God actually calls Gideon.
You're right.
What's going on there?
Yeah.
And this is your insight, so I want to set up for you as a question to
Yeah.
help elucidate.
Yeah, I didn't catch this till I got to the end of the Gideon story and thought to myself, wow, he wasn't a very good deliverer, right? He really wasn't. And so then I went back and found out the text never says specifically that God rose out a deliverer. Instead, we're just kind of introduced to this man as just a normal guy who God has chosen to use because God is in him. Why did he choose Gideon? Maybe because of his wit and his smarts. Like later we find out he's a very intelligent, brilliant man. We can talk about that in a minute. And maybe he had some sort of willingness and openness in his heart. We don't know why he was chosen. But he just seems to kind of find this guy hidden in a wine press. Kind of cowardly, in fact.
I mean, I've always kind of wondered, why did God choose Abraham back in the original story in Genesis?
Yeah.
And I'll link to this and in the show notes. But Marty Solomon has on BEMA podcast has a whole episode, I think, on this about why did God choose Abram at the time? And it's basically because he showed compassion to the woman who had been the outsider. His brother's wife was without. She's a widow, so Abram takes her on as his wife and shows her compassion and gives himself to her. So God's looking for people who would give themselves away to partner with to put the world back together. That's Marty Solomon's point.
It was almost as if he was showing righteousness before he knew what righteousness was.
Yes, exactly. And so that's almost like, I wonder if Gideon in some way showed that spark that God was tying into.
Yeah, something.
And I think he at least sees some characteristics of Moses and Gideon, because there's so many parallels with Moses throughout this part of the calling of Gideon in this section, verses 11 through say the end of 27. But you called out several of those parallels between Moses and Gideon. Do you want to run us through those?
Yeah. If I miss one, look, catch it.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to me because Moses also was just kind of a guy who really was disobedient and just not really following God in any way. Just kind of ordinary guy. And here you have Gideon, just kind of an ordinary guy hiding in a cave wine press and trying to survive and make do. And God comes to him and says, the Lord is with you. You are a mighty warrior. And you're like, he's hiding in a wine press. I don't see.
I think you said the phrase, he's a coward in a cave.
He's a coward in a cave, yes. And it's interesting that the Lord's like, but that's exactly what it says with Moses. Moses is no one. He's like, I can't even speak good. And he's like, it's because I am with you.
Well, even Moses had killed an Egyptian and ran away.
Yeah,
right?
he did. He ran away.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And what's interesting is Gideon's first response is, okay, well, if you are with me, how am I supposed to believe you? If you are who you say you are, you've abandoned us for all these years. How am I supposed to know you are who you are, right? And Moses does the same thing. He's like, God, who am I supposed to say you are? Because you've not been with us for 400 years. You've let us be alone.
You've abandoned us,
he says. And so their responses are very similar, where it's like, okay, if you are who you say you are, which I'm not sure yet, right? How do I know you are who you are, and how am I going to tell others who you are?
Right.
And that is a normal response. It's okay to question. I think questioning is a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
so we both start with questioning.
It's just when we get stuck in our questions and don't move on.
And Moses has 5 in a row.
Right.
5 hesitations in a row. He finally gets it. God's like, I'm using you if you like it or not, buddy.
Well, I almost feel like Moses moved beyond his questions and understood. He finally got into a place in his relationship with God where he understood. His questions helped him enter into the relationship.
Yes,
Gideon never gets beyond those questions, or he uses the questions for his own self-aggrandizement at the end. We'll get there. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but kind of that's the difference to me between them.
Absolutely, they are different. I think what we're supposed to notice here is this is obviously set up almost exactly like the Moses story.
Yeah.
Gideon could have been another Moses. That's the whole point, I think we're supposed to imagine.
Yeah.
And he ends up being a weak, puny
dictator.
Yes.
Yeah.
He does, not following God at all. And I think to myself, if Gideon would have owned up to the call that God is saying, I'm with you, and he's like, all right, let's go.
We talked.
The story could be very
That
different.
just makes me think about, Yeah, absolutely. The story could be very different. And it makes me think about lost opportunities when we don't follow the call of God.
Yeah.
And God's purposes get accomplished through here.
Yes.
It takes a kind of a weaving path.
Yes.
But how much more direct and less evil-filled and less painful for the people involved if Gideon and the Israelites would have been faithful. And that's not just calling out the Israelites. That's calling out all of us who, every day when we fail to follow God's call.
Yeah.
How much more easy and just fulfilling God's purposes and kingdom within the world could we be a part of? And how much more direct and less delayed could it be if we were faithful?
Yeah, it's the Bible is written in a way that it is self-reflective in the sense that I wrote down a couple of different times this week, where in my life am I acting like Gideon?
Yeah.
I wrote that down several times this week.
Where am I not fulfilling the call of God upon me?
Exactly.
Yeah. And go ahead.
No, I was just going to move forward where it talks about more of this conversation.
I wanted to call out before we left this section, the angel of the Lord comes in verse 11 and sits under the oak tree again.
He does.
Almost like the oaks of Mamre in Genesis.
This is absolutely the Abraham story where he's sitting in a tent and he's at the tent and he shows up, and then what do they do? What does Abraham do?
He shows tremendous hospitality to the guests.
And he goes and makes a meal.
Yep.
Guess what's about to happen here? He's about to go make a meal.
There you go.
He's about to go make a meal and then serve it on the altar. So I think it's really, really cool.
Yeah.
Little point out here. Call back to this oaks moment. And I love trees, of course I do.
Then in verse 16, we have God calling Gideon to strike the Midianites as one man.
Yes, that's an interesting phrase.
Yeah.
I looked it up because I was like, okay, that's interesting. As one man, because in Deborah's story, Deborah asked all these nations to arise and to arise and arise, basically calling everyone to participate. And some did, some didn't. Yeah. And they were blessed or cursed based on that. Here, he's saying, I'm asking you, and you're going to do this as one man. So I looked it up. This one man phrase is meaning like, if you are so unified with the person you're working with, it's as if you are one. He's basically saying, we're going to work as a pair. We're going to work as a team.
God and Gideon.
And he said, we're going to work so closely that it as if one man is operating and you're doing this alone. That is the point. God is asking him and telling him, you are going to do this. You're going to be successful at it. He's basically saying, not only are you doing this alone, but you will be successful. You are untouchable, is what he's basically saying. And he's like, and it's as if we are one. This is important because the call is for him to do it alone, and we're going to see what he does next.
We'll see in chapter 7 there. Before we get to chapter 7, we have a couple of things left in 6 to cover. Yeah. Gideon calls God Yahweh for the first time in verse 22.
Yeah.
I think you called that out, right?
Yes. So throughout this whole section, he's been calling God Elohim this whole time. And then he gets this meal and he's basically testing God. And people say, wait, am I supposed to test God? Is that okay? Let's talk about it. Is it okay to test God? So what he's doing is he's trying to confirm, is this actually Yahweh?
Because they didn't know him for a long time.
They didn't know him. In fact, we find out that his father is actually the head high priest of the religion Baal.
Now that's awkward.
That is awkward, right? He's the high priest of this. He's the one who owns it. He's the one who controls it. He's like the high priest of Baal, the religion of Baal, which we'll talk in a second. Baal is the storm god. He's the storm god. So pay attention to what happens. He's basically testing, are you Yahweh? So he puts this food out. The angel of God tells him how to prepare it and where to put it. He puts it there, and then it says fire comes from heaven. Now, mind you, in Hebrew, there's no word for lightning. So fire from heaven is actually a lightning strike. So a lightning strike comes down and he consumes the food. Wow. Oh, wait, hold on. He's been worshiping Baal, the lightning, thunder god, the storm god. Are you kidding me?
It doesn't get better than that.
Doesn't get better. God's like, I'm going to take the very thing you've been worshiping and be like, look who I am. I am the real one.
He did that all throughout the Egyptian plagues,
exactly
right? He was taking on the Egyptian gods and showing them how he's one-upping them.
He one-upped
yeah.
exactly what we're supposed to imagine here, for sure, right? This is a Moses character, potential Moses character. Exactly what we're supposed to imagine. So he sees him consume this meal with lightning from heaven. So he's like, wow, this guy's greater than Baal, right?
Yep.
And he goes, Yahweh for the first time. He calls him Yahweh, which is super amazing. So he's like, all right.
Wow.
And he says, all right, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go destroy your father's temple and tear it down. You're going to cut down some other pillars from some other things in the area, and you're going to do that. And how do you imagine? Here's the thing. If God is saying you're about to destroy and take over all the Midianites alone, and this is kind of like, how do you imagine he's supposed to do this, destroy the temple thing? Think he might try to supposed to be doing it alone? Potentially, like maybe this is like a trial. Like before we destroy all the Midianites, let's just see if you can do this one little thing alone. And what does he do? Does he do it alone? No, he takes 10 servants with him to do it in the middle of the night. So not only did not do it alone, but he was scared and did it in the middle of the night. So this is already like Gideon's like, I'm going to call you Yahweh, but I'm not sure quite yet.
Well, then he gets called out and the people get mad at him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they come look to his father, asking his father to deliver him up because they want to kill him.
Well, being in the middle of the night didn't work so well in this small town. Right. Everyone knows everyone. It didn't take very long for them to figure out who did it, right?
Yeah. I mean, he's probably one of the few that got access to that area, right?
Right. And you have these 10 servants with you. He said, I was totally Gideon. He asked me to help.
And then what does his father do? He doesn't turn him over. He says, hey, Baal, if Baal was so powerful, why is my son still alive? We destroyed his temple, and for every day that my son is still alive, that must mean that Yahweh is greater than Baal.
Exactly.
And so let's rename my son to Jerubbaal in verse 32.
Yeah, this is fascinating, right? His father renames his son.
Contender of Baal is what that
exactly
means.
What it means. Basically, it's saying Yahweh or Baal, right? And he's basically saying every time you hear this name, every time you see this name for the rest of these chapters, it's supposed to put in our imagine. This is no longer about Gideon. This is Yahweh versus Baal, right? Is who's greater than? That's exactly what we're supposed to imagine. So, what's interesting is Gideon had the platform of Joshua here or of Moses here to say, here's who I believe in. I saw Yahweh's angel face to face, right? Here's why I did what I did. But instead, his dad, who has never experienced Yahweh at all, was a bigger mouthpiece than Gideon himself. Gideon kind of hides behind his dad, and his dad goes, hey, wait a second. If you're still alive, this is a testimony to who this Yahweh is. Maybe he had a little doubt here, and that's why he didn't kill him.
Yeah.
He doubted Baal for a little while.
That's interesting.
It's so fascinating, isn't it?
And so Gideon is so faithful to God, so on point, he has to test him again. I was being sarcastic there.
I caught it. I caught it. I don't know if they did, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, I decided to call it out just in case y'all thought I was serious. But the sign of the fleece, there's two tests here at the end of chapter 6, verses 36 through 40. And he's at the threshing floor again, which is where God found him. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost like this, the threshing floor is almost like this place of testing, it seems like, that we're getting this theme, right?
Yeah.
So Gideon tests God again and says and basically says, hey, I'm laying this fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it's dry on the ground, then I shall know that it's you, and that you will save Israel by my hand. And then early in the morning, verse 38, when he rose early in the morning and to squeeze the fleece, he wrung out enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl of water. And then we almost do the opposite in the next two verses, right? So, and you had some points that we might have Donald's nephew Dewey here entering the story.
You were supposed to. You gave it away too soon. You hit the punchline too early. All right.
Well, once you set it up and walk us through how we got there.
Everyone's like, what are we talking about? All right. What's really interesting about this is earlier I said he tests God, right? He tests him, and I said, is that okay? Well, it was okay because over and over again we see when you test God to see if it's really him, that's a good thing. Even in Deuteronomy, it tells us a couple different times, I think it's in 14 and 18, that when someone comes claiming to be Yahweh, if someone comes claiming to do miracles, right, you're supposed to test them. No. And if they're not God, if you test them they're not God, you're supposed to kill them, right? Yeah. You're supposed to test things and make sure it is God. But once you know it's God, right?
Don't test him.
Here's the different. This is the bad test. God has proven who he is. He calls him Yahweh himself.
Because the scriptures say don't test the Lord your God.
Right.
But that's in the context of when you know.
Once you know who he is. Exactly right. So the first testing was fine.
Yeah.
Here, now he's like, all right, I've tested you. I know you're Yahweh. I've called you Yahweh to the point where I was faithful enough to destroy my father's temple, right? That showed a little bit of faith. Yeah. I'll give him a little credit.
That's some chutzpah there.
But, right. That's some faith, right? He stepped forward. He did the thing. But now he's doubting again. He's like, I don't know. Maybe. Why don't you give me another sign? Why don't you do this thing for me, right? And or two. And it's like, you just want to do this to your head. But the reason he chose this testing, it seems really odd. Why did he choose this one? Here's the why. Remember, he's been worshiping the god of Baal. Baal is the weather god, is the storm god. He controls the dew, the morning dew. In fact, Baal's daughter's name is Dewy, the morning dew, not Donald Duck's nephew.
Oh, so it's not Donald Duck's. I'm sorry, I totally got your lesson and point there wrong. Sorry about that.
Yeah, whatever.
Now, and I would also call out before we leave Baal in chapter 6 that Baal is the same god in the Greek pantheon of gods as Zeus.
Yeah.
This is Zeus. So we're used to this name in our own historical mind, right? Because a lot of us have studied Greek mythology. Same God.
Interesting. That's a good point. That's really helpful because he's the lightning, right? All of the lightning hand. So God's striking lightning right already in the story.
Yep.
So you have basically he's testing him twice, saying, "Are you greater than Baal or not?" Right? And so I think this is what's happening. And God's like, "All right, dude, I've chosen to use you. I'm gonna do these signs, even though it's not the right thing to do." Right?
Do these signs.
I see what you did there. And God does it. So there you go. He's like, all right, but he still doesn't call him Yahweh. He still just calls him Elohim. So he does the test. He does it enough to kind of move forward, but he still is not fully faithful. So let's keep moving on. Well,
then there's a couple of places in chapters 7 and 8, as just setting up those last two chapters. In 7 verse 1, for example, then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early, etc. So they call him Jerubbaal a couple times, but not every time. And when they do call him, it's almost like, oh, we have to clarify this is Gideon. Right. That's not just me inserting that. That's in the text.
Yeah, it says this is Gideon. Yeah.
And so I don't know what you do about that. So that's interesting. But we have we kind of have this first part of chapter 7 where we, as you said, God called Gideon to act as one man, and God to act as one man. So Gideon's not supposed to have companions,
right? But
he calls 36,000 of them.
Yeah, a lot. It looks like 32 maybe.
32,000.
22 plus 10.
Yeah.
So 32,000 men. That is crazy.
Yeah, it's a lot of people.
You know what's interesting? We kind of skipped over right before this. So right before this happens. It has a phrase in verse 34 that's really fascinating. It talks about God. God comes to Gideon and he says, and he lays his spirit, and his spirit clothed Gideon. His spirit. That's the Holy Spirit entering onto Gideon. Yeah. This is, if you've played Super Mario Brothers, right? Have you played this before?
Yeah.
Great game. Have you ever in a game and you just run into the star all of a sudden?
Yeah.
What happens in the game of the star? What happens?
You get almost invincibly powerful and start running very fast.
Right. The music speeds up. Right? You get this feeling. It's energy.
I was going to say, you almost get this adrenaline rush as a game player.
Yeah, you get this energy. The music speeds up. All of a sudden, you're literally invincible. Yeah. And you are I don't care if you're 5 years old or 35, I'm not 35 years old, you instinctively start running in the game because you know you're invincible, right?
Yep.
Here you have it. Gideon gets the star. The star is clothed over him, and Gideon sits on his butt, and he sounds the trumpets for help.
Wow.
God's like, I've called you to do this as one man. We're going. The star is on you. Go. You're invincible, man. Nice. And he doesn't do it. He sits on his butt. He calls the trumpets, and he has all these people come. And if I was watching you, Craig, in the game, and you got the star, and you just stopped moving in the game, what do you think I would do?
Kill you.
I would literally say this. No, I can't.
Kill me, whatever.
I would literally go, Craig, what are you doing? You're an idiot. I would go, Craig, you're wasting it.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. Go, you're wasting it.
That makes sense.
Gideon's wasting it.
Yeah.
He's wasting it. So then he comes, he comes, and now he has all these people, and God's like, all right, dude, we got to do something with this. I got to whittle this down. Why? Well, God already said why. Yeah. He says very clearly, too many people means they're going to take their own glory. Like the people are going to say they did this instead of God, number one. Or number two, the enemy that you defeat are going to say it was Israel and not God. Yep. So he's doing it because he wants him to have the glory, just like the Pharaoh story. Yeah. Over and over and over again. I'm doing this because I want to be seen as Yahweh, right? Yep. This is over and over again. You're supposed to get these Exodus, Moses.
Because God is trying to make himself known. And exactly. He needs the people to see it again so they'll come back to him.
That's exactly right. And
people always want a sign, and then they get a chance to have a sign, and they just like moving on because they're not paying attention.
So out of these weird stories, which we don't have time to talk about how he dwindles them down, but basically these two stories, he dwindles them down all the 300 people. Yeah. So 300 people now, God's like, all right, I'll compromise a little bit because 300 people is kind of like nothing compared to Midianites. They're like locusts, remember?
And so kind of to that point, by verse 12, we have parallel language to the promises of God made to Abraham. Yeah. Because it's talking about applying... I'll just read it in verse 12.
Yep.
And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, and the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. And so I got this direct reference back to Genesis 15, verses 5 and 6, where God promises Abraham to make his descendants as numerous as the stars.
Yeah. And he also says in, I think, chapter 13, as numerous as the dust along the land.
Yep. Genesis 13, verses 14 through 17.
So what's interesting here is when I read that, so you have in the same line, them talking about the locusts. Remember, in the Exodus story, Israel is described as a swarm of locusts. Yep. And that's why Pharaoh is scared and nervous for them to take over. And also you have, in Numbers, you have Balaam. Balaam also looks out and he says there is numerous as locusts on the land. So what's interesting is that all of a sudden you have the narrator intentionally using language that as a Jewish meditator of the word, I would know these phrases immediately as phrases that have been used throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Torah, as things that represents God's blessing upon us, right? So if I'm reading this and I'm a meditator of the word and I know the word well, I would instantly go, whoa, something's really wrong here.
Yep.
If the very phrases that were used for God's blessing upon his people is being used to talk about the enemy, that means we're in real bad shape.
Yep.
We're in real bad shape. That's intentional language, which is interesting that they do this here.
Yeah, it's things are so flipped on their head from what they should be, that God's blessings are being applied and almost co-opted by the enemy.
Yeah.
Wow.
It is wow. We have some stories here about some interesting stories here in 7 that we can talk about. Or we want to go to 8. We have a few more minutes. What do you think is best? Okay. Mr. Host. What's best?
So I found it interesting that Gideon overhears. So he doesn't have faith, right? So God sends him down to the camp to reinforce his understanding of what's going to happen. In the camp in the dead of night, Gideon overhears 2 soldiers talking about the dream where they dreamed of Gideon coming at them with a sword.
Yes.
And so then, Gideon all of a sudden is puffed up, and there's a battle cry that he gives to his people in verse 18. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp and shout for the Lord and Gideon. And then in verse 20, when they actually do it, they add, and a sword for Gideon. So it's like, what's going on with them adding to the battle cry in verse 20? As opposed to what God told them to do? Yeah,
that's a great question. I have so many thoughts as you're talking. Number one, the very first thing I noticed in this story was that when God tells Gideon to go down to camp, basically he's saying this: all right, we dwindled you down. I'm about to send you out. I already know that you're not going to like it. And I know that you're not going to go alone. So I'm going to let you take a servant with you. He gives him permission to take a servant. He's like, you're not going to go alone.
Yeah.
So take a servant with you. I thought that was funny. It made me laugh. He goes down. He hears these men's dream. And the dream is about Gideon And Gideon, they're scared of Gideon and the sword, right? Yahweh's going to have Gideon defeat all of us, and it's because of Gideon's sword specifically in the dream. What's fascinating is right after these two random men, right? Remember, these two random men are talking about a dream. He finally calls him Yahweh in the very next sentence again. The second time he's called him Yahweh in these stories. And I thought to myself, wow, it took two random men talking about Gideon in a dream for him to recognize God as Yahweh again. I just thought that was really sad.
Yeah, it is.
You know, that for me, I heard that was really sad. But he calls him Yahweh again. He sees him. I was like, all right, I guess I got my spirits. My spirits were lifted. Yep. That's all I needed.
So then
he goes and he changes the battle plan, I think, Craig, because Gideon is clever. And he's brilliant. We're going to see two military tactics that he uses. Two military tactics that he's going to use to kind of almost undermine the fact that God dwindled him down to 300 people. Yeah. He's like, you might have dwindled me down to 300 people, but I'm going to use my military tactics to try to get defeat. So he changes the battle cry because I think he already knows they're specifically scared of Gideon's sword. And that's why he says this. He makes it sound like there's a whole bunch of people and here comes Gideon's sword and they freak out, right?
Well, I mean, he's already saying this isn't, going back to the battle cry in verse 18 and 20, you would think he would say this is for the Lord. Yeah. But he's got to say this is for the Lord and Gideon. So how else is he going to get his glory if he doesn't contribute and help God out, right? Help God out.
When I saw that he said and for Gideon, I was like, oh boy, what a bad shape. Yeah. I felt this one come in. The second military tactic, just to throw it out real fast, that he uses, since I said two of them, the other one he does is he has all the men have, half of them blow trumpets and half of them have the lamps, the jars with fire in them. So in battle, you would have the flag bearer, right? And for every 100 people, you would have one flag bearer. 100 fighters, you'd have one flag bearer. Well, this is at night. So at night, you don't have a flag bearer. They're no good. So you have someone holding a torch in the jars here, specifically in the jars. And so what I think Gideon is doing that's so brilliant, really honestly is brilliant, even though it's totally disobeying and undermining God's plan here. It's brilliant. What he's done is he's taken all 300 men, and half of them are supposed to be the trumpets, which for every 100 people there was a trumpet. Fighters, there was a trumpet. And for every 100 people there was one flag bearer. And their job was as things were in chaos, they would have nowhere to come back to kind of be like, okay, regroup, I'm not alone, and they go back out again, right? So when you're at night and you're the Midianites and you look out and you see, 150 torches surrounded, and you hear 150 trumpets coming. What do you imagine? How many people do you imagine that are there?
30,000 people.
How many people did Gideon start with?
300.
30, between 30,000 and 33, right? 30,
before God whittled them down, 32,000.
I'm saying 32,000. So basically what Gideon has done tactically, the Midianites think he is exactly the same number as he started with.
Yeah.
That is brilliant and totally dismining God.
Yep.
Yeah. Fascinating.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
And so, through those tactics and through God being with him, in spite of it all, he defeats the Midianites. But in the first of chapter 8, the tribe of Ephraim is mad at Gideon. Why? I was like, this room for a loop. All of a sudden, we're all successful, and Ephraim is mad. What's going on?
It's fascinating, right? That also stood out to me, so I went some digging on it. Remember, Gideon blew his trumpet.
Yeah.
After he got the star.
Yep.
He got the star. He blew his trumpet. They had the opportunity to join. They were called too. They could hear the trumpet just as well. And so they had a choice to join. But here, it's almost interesting. It's almost like, well, you could have asked us to help. We would have loved to get the spoils. And it's like they wanted the spoils without actually doing the work. And in here, Gideon, I think, sees this in them, and he plays and kind of flatters them. He's like, yeah, but you're going to get the credit because you got their heads, right? He kind of flatters their pride here. Note to self, just put a little pin here. This will not be the last time we see Ephraim as a group of people who will not go to call upon war, but they will try to take the spoils of war. Just pay attention. This is going to come up again, I think. This might be just the kind of character of who they are. Mm-hmm.
And then Gideon runs across Succoth and the city of Penuel and has some harsh things to say about them because they're not going to help him and bring him in and give him water and food and such. And kind of start to see the pattern of a dictator forming here, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Kind of ruthless.
He is. I thought to myself, my gosh, I mean, he threatens them in a way. And I know you say things in the heat of the moment, because they're tired, they're exhausted. Isn't Israel supposed to be a hospitable people? Ella says that all the time.
Right.
Have they even lost that? Have they even lost that they're even hospitable people? Mind you, they are rebels. Gideon and his 300 men are kind of like the rebels. Well, like, if you think about it, if the rebels lost and they found out that I helped them, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
And so there is a sense of like why they're not helping is not just because they're being mean to Gideon, but they're kind of like, I know you're my brother. We know we're Israel. These are Israelite towns, by the way. I know you're Israelites, but you're also the rebels here, and I'm saving myself here. Like, that's how disconnected and ununified they really are. And that's why God wanted to unify with him, Gideon, because let's be honest, that's why God was wanting to unify with Gideon here. Anyways, and so these two groups, and then Gideon actually follows through with his threats to a T. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
What I made a note here was, isn't a judge supposed to deliver his people from the hands of evil? Here, he actually becomes the one delivering evil.
Wow.
He doesn't deliver them. He's the one who's destroying them. His own people. It's almost worse.
He's the very thing. He becomes the very thing he was called to eradicate or fight against. Very Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader in Star Wars. I had to work it in. I just had to.
I don't even know what any of those terms even meant. Here's the thing: is you have a man who started as a coward in a cave. Yeah. And here he's becoming crazy, confident, and controlling. Yep. I used all C's, and I'm off of the fly.
Very sermon-like of you.
That was on the fly, too. That was fresh.
That's
the phrase.
But
fascinating.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, coming in to wrap chapter 8 up, 22 to the end, in the episode of the ephod, he taxes the people. He's like, they're like, be our king. He's like, no, I am a faithful, God-fearing man, right? But, but then he starts to act like a king because he taxes them.
Yep.
They build, or they use the taxes, which is gold, silver, etc., to build this ephod, which remind us again what an ephod is. Yeah,
an ephod was something that was made specifically for the high priest. It was made in Leviticus. It's actually it's set up in Exodus, but you see it in Leviticus. Yeah. It's actually made of linen. So you have a linen vest that the high priest would wear, and on the linen vest were all these gemstones, the 12 gemstones that represented the 12 different tribes, and the high priest would wear that. Here, it's not made from linen. What is it made of?
It's made of all the gold.
Straight gold. Yeah. So do you see a golden calf moment here?
Oh, yeah.
The golden calf buckle here. He's more like Aaron. This is the point. This whole time he's supposed to be set up like Moses. Here, the whole time he's been acting more like an Aaron. Yeah.
Another Exodus story parallel, but this one showing where it goes wrong again.
Yeah, it goes wrong.
And so whether he's wearing it or not, they worship the ephod, right? Yeah. And in verse 27, and Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in a city in Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there. That's where it says they worshipped it.
Yes.
And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Mm-hmm. So Midian was subdued. The people had rest and raised their heads no more, and the land had rest as well in the days of Gideon. So God's purposes are accomplished, but it's so bad that they have a dictator over them, and they hate him so much that when Gideon dies, in the last verses here of chapter 8, and picking up in verse 33, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal-bereth their god. And it goes on to say, and they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. So they started not knowing God. Gideon had some glimpses of who God was, acknowledged that. Obviously didn't translate that into educating the populace. He didn't set up worship of God.
No,
the people
he worships this.
Yep, the people never return to God, and so they never remember him. At the end of the story, they're even worse off than at the start.
Yeah.
It's almost like there's this pivot I think that you found
There's a huge
in verse 22, right?
There's a huge pivot here. What's interesting in verse 22, he calls him Yahweh yet again, but for the first time, it's in a different context. It's not as if he saw Yahweh for who he was and wanted to follow God. It was as if he was using Yahweh because every time he's done that, something good has happened, and it's like as if he's using Yahweh's name. Literally in vain, using God's name, but not because he doesn't really know him. In fact, he doesn't know him so well that immediately after he's worshiping something else.
Yeah.
And not only he's worshiping something that's made out of gold instead of linen. It's not even set up the proper way. Like it's like blasphemy. I mean, in every sense of it.
It's like you're using
abomination. I was trying to think of the word abomination.
Abomination.
That's the word. It's abomination.
Yep.
What we'll find is in this verse 22 is the first time. So far in the narrative, every time Gideon was talking to God and didn't really see him as God, was using the word Elohim. A few times he used Yahweh when he saw God for who he was. From here on out, we're going to see from Gideon's story and especially going to the Jephthah's story. It's going to be crazy. They use Yahweh all the time, but they don't know who he is. For the first time, a group of Israelites are calling Yahweh by Yahweh's name, but they don't know who he is, and they worship him much like a Canaan god, even though they're calling him Yahweh. This is a whole new type of evil. I don't know what to call it. Misunderstanding of God. It's
a violation of the commandment. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. And
you see a shift here, and we're going to see it throughout the rest of the story, and I think that's really fascinating. It's interesting that almost as Gideon, he takes on a role of king, even though he says he wasn't. He totally acted like one, right? And number one. Number two, he's wearing, or at least made, something of the high priest. And so he's almost acting like a king and a high priest. Wasn't that not only frowned upon, but totally against the law?
Yeah.
And wasn't it Saul who did that? And he got a death sentence because of it.
Yep. God wanted those separated for a reason, right?
Yes.
The one is too much power in the hands of one person, but there's supposed to be a check and a balance between the, I'll say for lack of a word, earthly ruler versus the spiritual representative of God, right? Mm-hmm. And they're both supposed to be ruling under God, but just like Samuel checked Saul and David, you need that check and balance between the high priest / prophet and the king and the ruling power.
I have one more quick thought, and I'll let you wrap up today. You get to do a wrap up today.
I can't wait.
Okay. My last comment is that it talked about the land had rest for 40 years. I want us to be very clear that this land might have been at rest militarily.
Yeah.
But it was not at rest. They were not delivered from oppression. They were just under Gideon's oppression here.
Yeah.
And they were far from God nonetheless.
They turned one form of occupation and oppression into another.
Yeah.
And we can all do that in life if we are not following God, because if we're not following God, we're following something else. We're going to follow something. We don't have a choice in that. Yeah. We have a choice of what to follow, and that's God or an idol.
Yeah.
You're going to choose to follow the idol, the Baals, which will lead to cursings and death, or you're going to follow God, who is the source of all of our life, and in whom we breathe and move and have our being, as Paul, quoting the Greek philosopher, says in Acts. So just keep that in mind as you go through the week after Easter coming up, and as we worship our resurrected God, our resurrected Jesus, our Savior. Remember that He's also our Lord, and we're supposed to follow Him in life so we can have life more abundantly. And that's life here more abundantly, not just life after death, which is obviously ours in Christ as well. But we're meant to have life here and have it more abundantly on this earth to bring peace, God's shalom, God's kingdom to the world around us that is horribly broken. Mm-hmm. And so let's follow the call of Jesus and not act like Gideon did when God called him and he did not respond in faith. But Jesus did respond in faith. He responded to God's call perfectly, even to death on the cross. We pray for you that you are blessed by the readings this week. We pray that y'all are blessed this week and have a good one and be Jesus to everybody in the world. See y'all next week.
Bye, y'all.